Back. In our last segment, we're going to be speaking to Mohammad Groenewald of the Boorhanol Islam Movement in the Bo-Kaap in Cape Town about not just their history and their legacy and the founders of this movement and what it's been doing lately, but also about the feeding happening in the month of Ramadan in various parts of Cape Town and how you can assist in terms of feeding and assisting and donating. And then lastly, as we get ready for Eid, which eventually will come with the rapid rate at which Ramadan is traveling, the adorning of the fez as a marker of history and heritage that they are reviving at the Boorhanol. Uncle Muhammad, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and to all your listeners, and hope you're enjoying Ramadan this far.
Yes, as fast as it's going, we're trying to hold on and enjoy this journey that we're on. And we just spoke to Uncle Shafiq Morton, and he has definitely recalibrated our thinking about how one can spend our time in this month, looking at the examples of Awliya and implementing that into our daily lives. And, something that comes to mind is the practical implementation of the deen and the practical implementation of its values and systems in our local context. And the Boorhanol Islam Movement is an example and manifestation of that practical application. But of course, I won't be speaking about the Boorhanol Islam Movement. I'll be asking you to, Dr. Muhammad, and I'll ask you for a brief history of this movement just in short, before we go into the examples of work that it does insofar as the community can support and insofar as listeners can maybe be inspired by, inshallah.
Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The Boorhanol Islam Movement has always been I think, a key focal point of the Bo-Kaap community. The masjid was, of course, first started. It was first called Pilgrim Masjid. And it was also one of the three masjids, besides the Awal Masjid was started by a woman. The second masjid as well was donated by a woman. The masjid in Long Street that we call Palm Tree Masjid, and of course Boorhanol Masjid. Khuwaida, she also donated a piece of land and they built a masjid. But also significantly, also remember the Boorhanol Masjid. It was sort of established after 1804, after freedom of Islam came to the Cape. Muslims lived under repression, under Dutch repression prior to that. But 1804, freedom of religion, or partial freedom, I would argue, was granted to the Muslim community. And the Boorhanol Masjid was the very first masjid to get a minaret. Of course, prior to that, the Islam sort of masjid was very undercover masjid. The masjid literally just looked like a home. And basically, people practice their deen in there and so on. And so Boorhanol Masjid is very much significant in terms of having the very first minaret built, and of course other masajid that follow. So after 1804, structures could now look like a masjid and so on and so forth. So the Boorhanol Islam Movement have a number of projects. I mean, it has evolved over the years and so on. And two of our great sons were very instrumental in Boorhanol for getting it where it is now, and that is of course But Ahmed Davids, and Imam Abdul Rahman Basir, affectionately known as Imam Mani Basir. They basically started a number of subcommittees and certain things to enhance, especially the skills of Bo-Kaap community, a number of social programs and so on. And these social programs, of course, still run up to today. And other issues was also introduced. For example, one of the few last projects that we did was the Boorhanol Cradle to the Grave exhibition. We've turned the center, some part of it, in a bit of a museum to showcase Muslim lifestyle. The Boorhanol also have the social welfare, which plays a pivotal role, especially in the month of Ramadan. And of course, the publishing, the bookatreats, all of those things gets published under that. And also the Taraweeh survey, that sort of survey all the masajid in the Western Cape. Where people can now go online and view different masajid and see what they have to offer and so on. As you know, publishing or printing things nowadays have become extremely expensive, and that is why we now just have to move to digital rather than printing. And some of the things that Boorhanol also does is, of course, our latest addition is the kwaskufia, or the red fez, that is traditionally known in the Cape. and sort of kind of reviving that particular culture, and the making and the skills of that particular tradition of the Cape, to make sure that we don't lose the tradition. We've lost so many things already, our tailors, dressmakers, and so on. But
Everything is
this.
ordered on Timo. We can't order a kufia on Timo, Uncle Muhammad. I think it will be a great tragedy of our time to allow
No,
for that.
absolutely.
And
You must remember the Kwaskofia in itself was the identity of a Muslim at the time, mid 1800s, late 1800s, and so on. It was really the identity of a Muslim. In fact, Muslims wore it, wear the kufiya with a great pride. And also, it was a symbol of our Islam identity, but also for the non Muslims. If you had to walk in the street, sometimes judges will also say, no, no, get somebody with a fez, they are truthful
mm,
people, and so on. And often when there is even disputes, they say, no, no, you must get the Muslim. And how do you get the Muslim? Somebody that wears the red fez. But also, if you look at the old pictures of our sporting clubs, Ottomans, etc., Primroses, etc., whether they were cricket clubs or rugby clubs, but once they take their picture, the team picture, everyone were there,
mm.
well attire, everyone have suits and so on. The identity, they always had worn their identity, and that was their phases, whether it's a Netherlands team, it's singing and so on.
Mm.
That identity was important for us as a Muslim community, especially in that particular period, and so on. And of course, it got a fascinating history, the Red Phase, and how even it comes in to the Cape and so on.
So, I mean, maybe we can start there. What is the history of the connection of this phase to the rest of the world? Because surely it didn't arrive in isolation from the Teva Mountain, and so it was worn. Of course, there's a greater geopolitical history there, which I'd love for you to share with us.
Yeah, well, we've looked at it, and I mean, Diane Peterson, of course, he did a fantastic job at the launch by, doing a bit of research into this and kind of explaining some of this history. And basically, in fact, there's only three countries in the world that's still making the red fez. One of it is Cape Town, and then there's Morocco and Egypt. Right? So I got a friend of mine, Shaheen Francis, uh, made one, bought one for me in Morocco. And, I actually won that one when we had the launch of our Red Face project and so on. They're literally the three countries that are still making the Red Face. And so Cape Town, fairly isolated from the rest of the world, still keeping the tradition alive. So, by the time the Ottoman Empire kind of ruled the Muslim world at the time, many still wear turbans and different types of other forms of hats and so on. And one of the generals brought this fez to Sultan Mahmud, and from North Africa, and he kind of fell in love with this fez because it probably for him looks a bit more fancy and have a particular style to it and so on. So he then, of course, asked all these emissaries and generals and so on to start wearing this fez. And the Ottoman Empire was spread out throughout the Muslim world and so on. And this is probably how this fez then becomes fairly popular within Muslim circles, Muslim countries, and so on. Even certain non-Muslim countries like India, it was just, there it was not merely an identity; it was also, a fashion, because even non-Muslims, Hindus, and so on. If you look at certain older pictures, people just worn this particular fez and so on. So this red fez then kind of spread, throughout the Ottoman Empire, and so it started and so on. But if one look basically at its origin, where it sort of come from, the origin basically, a lot of people think, the term fez comes from the place called Fez,
Mm.
so in Morocco. But actually, it is actually, the dye for the material that came from Fez, not the Fez was made in sort of Tunisia, and just because the dye came from Fez, that term then stuck, the Fez. And so the fez also have other names, for example, tarbouche in many Arab culture. Like, for example, my particular fez inside there, because it comes from Morocco, is written in there tarbouche, and so on. But also, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, we also see these countries sort of leave off the fez. Some of these countries then bans the fez. For example, when Ataturk took over Turkey, he said, "No, don't wear this fez anymore. We're going to be Western." He become a nationalist, and so on. And all the other Arab countries also then follow suit in terms of become Arab nationalists. And Abdul Nasser in Egypt, and so on. And the fez gets banned, and so on. And so the fez becomes very unpopular, and so on. And you had the fez mainly restricted to certain religious things like graduations, and so on and so forth. Al-Azhar, for example, etc., and so on. So how does the fez then comes to the Cape? A lot of people also is a misperception that Abu Bakr Effendi then brought it to the Cape. But if you look at pictures of Abu Bakr Effendi, was the ulama, the old picture with all the ulama standing,
Yes.
and many other pictures, even at that time, you won't find anyone, including himself, wearing a red fez. There's no pictorial evidence of anyone at that particular stage wearing a red fez. Even if you look at slightly later or slightly earlier, there was no such thing as a red fez. Remember that time, people used to wear, even prior to that, a turang, the straw hat,
Yes.
or just ulama used to wear a turban around their heads, and so on. And even if you look at that picture of Abu Bakr Effendi standing there with all these ulama of the Cape welcoming him, no one, as I said, most of them have a turban. In fact, majority of them has a turban, and so on. So, Abu Bakr Effendi didn't bring the red fez with him, because at that time the red fez probably were not yet as popular even within the Turkish Empire or the Ottoman Empire at that stage. But what we then discovered is that, to the Jan's research, is that the father of Dr. Abdurrahman, that became counselor, first black counselor in Cape Town in 1904. His father then goes to Al Azhar University to go and study at Al Azhar. Haji Abdurrahman goes and study at Al Azhar University. And then, of course, amongst religious scholars, where this is, and he brought it into the Cape, and that was probably the first time people in the Cape Town sort of see the space. He probably bought a few and gave it to friends, family, and so on. And later, as you know, the Cape tradition and the Al Azhar, studying at the Al Azhar, more and more people went to study at the Al Azhar, and they brought the fez back. Some of them even brought it back to sell and make some money, for themselves, and so on. And even Sheikh Jassim them also, and there is really where I think the tradition really takes shape, because then instead of importing it now or bringing it with you when you come to holiday or end of the year, Sheikh Jassim, the Jassim then start to make these feathers, in Kapini, where they had, uh, you know, a bit of a workshop there at home, and start wearing these feathers, and more people then started to wear these feathers, and so on. So it sort of takes its kind of tradition from there, or its beginning from there, from the time Haji Abdul Rahman then starts to come to the Cape, and so on. And of course, that was also the period. Remember, Muslims. I think by 1834, the first Muslim only went for Hajj. Um, and even even during Hajj, that fez was not popular yet at that time, because if you look at some of the early Muslims that went on Hajj, they all still wear the turban. They came back with that, much
And
later.
I think a lot of the sort of ban that had more to do with Yemen and the Hijaz than it did
Yes,
with the Fez
yeah.
at the
In
time.
fact, the Saudi headgear was not even in existence at the time. So it was more the kind of Yemeni influence, and so on, into the Arab culture, in terms of the way you swing your turban around your head, and so on. So really, so that is basically how it's sort of started, very much in terms of they had this fez, and so on. And also, remember in Cape Town what emerged because of the Hajj tradition. How do we differentiate between a Haji and an ordinary Muslim? As I said, because Islam was literally banned in Cape Town under
mm,
the Dutch rule, for over 100 years and so on, under their rule, and Hajj tradition became very emotional in Cape Town. It still is very emotional. There's a great tradition, around Hajj, and that is because of its history. Muslims could never go and so on, and Imam Hassanuddin, Karl Pilgrim, that is also known by, he was the first then to go for Hajj and come back and so on. And so as the Hajj tradition grow after that, more and more people go on Hajj and Muslims, could afford financially to go on Hajj. They then devise a system where you have a fez with a tassel. And that is how you recognize a Haji from ordinary people. So if you haven't been on Hajj, you might just wear ordinary fez without the tassel. And in fact, the day of the launch, there's a lot of people from Bo-Kaap and outside of Bo-Kaap for the launch, and people, making all sorts of jokes and so on, and
yes, yes.
reminisce about, yeah, so they were saying there was one guy, he did wear a kufia, which we often, the kufia with the tassel, we refer to as a kwas kufia, a kwas
Right.
tassel, Africa, kwas kufia. And so he did wear a kwas kufia, and but he wasn't a Haji. So they said to
Mm.
him, hey, you can't wear a kufia, kwas kufia. You're not a Haji. He said, yeah. The Sheikh said, a few weeks ago, there's a hadith that say, if you have 40 Jumu'as, you are granted a reward of a Hajj. So
Sure.
that gives you the right away.
And so, Haji Khawat,
So,
um, but I mean, I suppose when one looks at all these things, it's attire, it's identity, it's politics, it's people, it's international relations, and it's also hopefully the future with this new revival project that's happening soon. But we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll speak about a little bit more about the details of this project, and then also what else Boorhanol is doing over the month of Ramadan, and how listeners can support before we break for Iftar here in Johannesburg at, I think, in exactly 10 minutes' time, which is quite soon. So we'll be back after a short break, inshallah.
Millions of Muslims around the world live in deep poverty.
this Ramadan.
So we in Johannesburg are about to break fast in 6 minutes, and in closing, we'd love to ask Uncle Mohammad Groenewald out in Bo-Kaap in the Cape for some ways in which we can spend our money in the way of charity this month. Sê gou vir ons, Mohammad, how can you support the community of Bo-Kaap and the broader Cape community in your Makhrajan feeding and in any other way possible as our listeners endeavor to strive in this month for reward?
No, shukran for the opportunity again. But as you know, Boorhanol Islam Movement is, as we said, is a key focal point of our community and in the surrounding areas from Woodstock, Salt River, and so on. And during the month of Ramadan, we cook every day, soup and give out bread, dates, and so on for people that have been fasting. And of course, as you know, these things, cost money and so on. And look, for us to make a pot of soup cost about 2,500 rand. And one of our biggest challenges this time around, because Ramadan is now coming earlier, into the summer. So as you know, in Cape Town, we always joke you have two difficult months. That is January, full of worries, and December, worry. And then people still recovering, from the holidays and all of that. So your ordinary person that normally used to give you, bits of small amounts of money, that is sort of very much, been our challenge, to raise particular funds this time around during this month of Ramadan. And then, of course, during the last day of Ramadan, we make about 80 pots of food, a biryani, 100-liter pots. And of course, if listeners want to donate anything, it's about 4,000 rand a pot. And of course, one of the challenges this year again, one of our big sponsors has, pulled out that normally comes along, but alhamdulillah, they've been there for many, many years with us. And so that remains our challenge. So listeners that want to, contribute to that project, there's a soup kitchen and there is the Makharajan, which we call, the end of Ramadan when we cook our food. That's 4,000 rand a pot. If people want to, they can. And also remember, during the month of Ramadan, we also give people, we have moved away from food parcels. And because sometimes you give people things they don't eat, etc. So what we have done now for the last 4-5 years, we have given people ShopRite vouchers, a 400 rand voucher. And that in itself, it is much better because even women, they can buy their own personal needs and etc. and so on, and the food that they require for Eid, etc. But also very, very importantly, a voucher. I would say if people go in shopping their own things, it brings more dignity, and that is basically the month of Ramadan. How do we restore dignity into people's lives, and so on? And that is why the Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, normally very generous, but during the month of Ramadan and more generous because the Nabi understood and tried to teach us the barakah of giving during the month of Ramadan. So I would like to urge our listeners to please support our Bo-Kaap project, the Boorhanol Islam Movement during the month of Ramadan, because remember, for all the Muslims, including the people living on the streets, etc., is very much dependent on Boorhanol. And of course, during the year, we cook every Thursday to make it easier for people, with a meal and so on. And of course, what we try to do in the month of Ramadan, we try to ensure that we cook the best standard. Even I can eat from the food. Anyone that walks in there can eat from that food. And in fact, when it comes to our soup, every 4 days, we buy fresh vegetables to ensure that the highest standard is maintained, and so on. And that is basically, what we do in the month of Ramadan. But again, I would urge listeners to please get in touch with me. Salami, it does have my contact details. To please try to donate towards this particular projects and so on, so that it can be a bit more manageable for us to make sure that some of the work that we do and some of the feeding that we do remains possible, inshallah.
Absolutely, Dr. Mohammed, thank you. I think first of all for taking us on that journey of the fez, and I remember one day with my grandfather, I walked into the kumas on a Eid day wearing this red fez, and he said, "But you not Haji, how can you wear this?" So I said, "Well, you are Haji, so why don't you and but I actually found a photo of him when he was about 13. This would have been in 40s, in the early 1940s, when he's been about 13, 14 years old. And there he is wearing a fez with a nice jacket on and so on, which he failed to tell me at that time, obviously. But we have fond memories of all of our elders being very pedantic about covering our heads in the mosque and so on. And of course, today is the Kop, and many of us do as we go from mosque and so on. But shukran for you, Putra Muhammad. It is time for breaking fast in Johannesburg right now. And we ask each and every one listening to keep all of us in your du'as and to donate generously to the Boorhanol Islam Movement and to consider the sacrifices that people have made for us to be Muslim today in this country as you do so, inshallah. Shukran. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
So we now with the time for breaking of fast, and we thank you for your listenership, and we ask that you have a blessed iftar with your family, and I'll look forward to speaking to you tomorrow, inshallah, same time, same place. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.